Hi, my name is Dylan, and this is my brain project. It might not look like it at first, but I assure you, this is my project. Although I am playing Minecraft, I made sure to accurately and correctly display the functions of the brain and where each part is on both the left brain and the right brain. So, without any further ado, let's get into this. So the first part we're going to be looking at is the key, because the key is, well, the part which has parts of the brain. So when you get up here, you'll see there's a map. This map shows the left brain and the right brain, and the two diagrams for them as well, and the two trains. But from a distance, you can see the diagram with the color-coded parts of the brain on both the left and right brain. On the right brain, I did have to substitute with some materials, like for example sponge and this new material. So yeah. So for the left brain, I made it easy to see the color coordinations and the brain itself, so that if you needed to, you can just look over here. And if you didn't know what this part is over here, you can just look up and go like, oh, there it is. And this part is the frontal lobe. The pink part is the Broca's area. The brown part is the motor cortex. The purple part is the parietal lobe. The yellow part is the temporal lobe. The lime part is the Wernicke's area. Dark green part is the sensory cortex. And the red part is the occipital lobe. And that's for the left brain. For the right brain, we have, for the magenta part, is the hippocampus. For the sandstone part, it is the thalamus. And then for the red wood part, it is the amygdala. And then for the gray part, it is the hypothalamus. And then for this little stone part, it is the pons. And then for the cyan area, it's the medulla. And then for the orange concrete part, it is the reticular inflammation. And then for the sponge part, it is the cerebellum. Now, when you get done reading off all this information, looking over it, you'll turn over here, and then you'll see two signs over here that say jump down. So we'll just jump down here, and that's when we get started. So the first part you might want to get started on is top portion, which is a little bit backwards, but oh well. So go for the lobby over here, which I made sure to decorate a little bit to make it look at least a little bit detailed. And then we get to the first area here, which is the Wernicke's area. The Wernicke's area is an area of the brain which is important for language development. So what I did is I made a language classroom. And as you can see, we have Spanish and we have French. I really don't know too much Spanish, so I did some of the words that I do know, which is hola, uno, dos, tres, and delicioso. And then you have French. I have taken French 1, French 2, and a little bit of French 3, which I'm in right now. So we have Très bien, merci, comment t'appelles-tu, ouvre le livre, ouvre le cahier, je m'appelle, au revoir, être, imparfait, and passé. So that brings us into our next section, which is the frontal lobe. The frontal lobe is an area concerned with behavior, learning, personality, and voluntary movement. There wasn't too much I can actually do to represent the frontal lobe, so what I did is I put a bunch of villagers because they do have behavior, they do learn, and they do have a personality, and they do move. So, what you do when you get here is you just move through, make sure to close the gate if you can, and it'll just move through with slight ease. Next part is the occipital lobe. The occipital lobe is the visual processing center of the brain. What I did for this section is I made a little art gallery on the front wall and the back wall, and all the sides as well. It's not too much, but it is a little bit fancy. So that brings us down to the bottom portion of the train. For the bottom portion of the train, we have the temporal lobe. The temporal lobe is important for memory, language, and hearing, along with many other functions. What I did for this is I made a little music note thing that you may have seen there beforehand. But it's just a small little tune that I made. Yep. And that brings us on to the next section, being the Broca's area. Broca's area controls language expression, which is when you smile or when it's basically any expression that you give. So here I made the bottom lip moving infinitely, and here I made the left cheek and right cheek. And that brings us down into the sensory cortex. The sensory cortex registers your body touch and movement sensations. So I made a little pressure plate here to represent when someone gets touched. When you get touched, the sensory cortex immediately pulls a signal for sensory information. That brings us down into the next part, which is the parietal lobe. Parietal lobe contains the primary sensory cortex, which controls sensation, being, touch, and pressure. What I did for this, I did a little tiny music disco thing to represent pressure and touch of a certain area. So imagine this as like the skin and then one portion's touched. Me being the area, or me being the area touched. Yeah. That brings us down into the motor cortex. The motor cortex, what I used to represent it, was the front of the train because what else moves than a train? So, the motor cortex is involved in the planning, control, and execution of voluntary movements. And the front of the train is usually the part where it controls where the train is going, either forwards or backwards, and how fast it's going. So, what I put in here is a little tiny redstone contraption going on to a little redstone block. And then an obnoxious little repeater thing, making stuff go up and down and all that. And then little tiny things right here. And then that brings us down into the second train, being the right train, or the right brain train. So, the first thing we'll do is get on to the second level. First, go through the lobby. And then that brings us to the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus plays an important role in regulating hormones and body temperature. What I used to represent this was lava and water. Water being cool, and lava being hot. And then that brings us into the amygdala. The amygdala is used to regulate emotions like fear. Now, in order to represent this, I need to make something creative. Observe. Enjoy. We go through this little area and get lost a little bit here. Shoot. And go over here. Go over here, and once you finally make it out, you lose your effects, and then that brings us into the pawns. Pawns help regulate body muscle movement, and what I use to represent this is just a simple demonstration. You go into Soul Sand, which represents if you're regulating your muscles to move slower. So, Get onto here, it's not too slow, but compared to regular walking, it's a little bit more slow. And I use packed ice to represent your muscles moving faster. And then it brings us into the next portion of the train, being the bottom portion. We go over to the back over here, and then we go into the thalamus. The thalamus is the post office of the brain, sending and receiving sensory messages in the cortex. Here I have a chest. We just grab a sensory signal from the chest and drop it into the hopper. Yep, here's our sensory signal. Drop it into there. And then we press a button and watch as the sensory signal comes out. And there we are. As simple as that. And I also made another demonstration over here. We step through these pressure plates to simulate sending and receiving signals. You'll see that these two lights will light up, and then the dispensers will also dispense something. Firework and a fire charge. That brings us into the hippocampus. The hippocampus is thought to be involved in long-term memory storage, and in making those memories hard to forget. To represent this, I made a ton of chest in a single compact area with a lot of cobwebs to represent that it's been here for a long time. Next, that brings us into the medulla. Medulla regulates basic functions of the body like sneezing, coughing, breathing, and vomiting. Here I have a little demonstration. Flick the lever. And here I have a little demonstration over here to simulate sneezing. And then that brings us into the reticular information. The reticular information regulates sleep and consciousness. To represent this, I made a little bedroom. Well, bedroom, being a ton of beds. And then finally, that brings us into the cerebellum. The cerebellum coordinates voluntary movements. And like the motor cortex, I made it the train as well to represent that it has to do with voluntary movements. Here we have a little compass and a sunflower to represent a wheel. And I think that concludes the project. I hope you enjoyed this video, and thank you for joining me. And thank you for looking at my project.